as we start this conversation. So first and foremost, my name is Chantella Barato. I am the Senior Manager of DID, and welcome to our DID Network program. We are so excited to have you all here with you today, and excited to wrap up 2023 and look ahead into 2024 with this amazing topic brought forth by one of our DID members. So today we are going to talk about the Winning Leadership Blueprint, Leveling Up DEIB Actions in 2024. And that B is for belonging. I know a lot of our organizations definitely have incorporated ensuring that we are creating a sense of belonging in addition to our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So just want to make sure everyone's familiar with what does that B stand for nowadays. So as I mentioned, I'm your host for today, Chantella Barato, Senior Manager of DID. And as a reminder, friendly reminder, the DID Network program was launched in 2021. It was a space created for a number of our different DID member companies to gather, share ideas, insights, best practices, but most importantly for us to learn in a very casual discussion and yet a very healthy discussion. I know it's been some time since we've gathered in this space, so just wanted to give you guys that friendly reminder of why these educational programs or learning programs are very important to us, and also invite you all to bring forward any topic that you feel is important that you would like to share in this community that we've created for you and that you are obviously a part of. So in the past, we posted conversations such as exploring anti-racist design, psychological safety in the workplace. And if you missed it, we'll definitely drop it into the chat. They are available to you on our YouTube channel, so feel free to check it out. Also, feel free to share this with your workforce. You know, we obviously understand that everyone's busy managing a lot of different things, but maybe it's something you would love to listen to during your time off, or something you want to share across your organization. So we'll make sure to drop in that YouTube channel in the chat. Today, I am joined by Studio Science, one of our 93 DID member companies. And Studio Science, for over 25 years, has worked in industry-defining enterprise and technology companies to solve business challenges through design. They help their clients achieve remarkable growth by identifying opportunities to design, better brand experiences, deliver better product experiences, and provide better e-commerce experiences as well. This past summer, Kelsey and Grace, your co-hosts for today, asked DID a question. How can they better implement DEIB strategies within their organization? And since then, we've had numerous discussions and conversations and decided to bring this topic forward to all of you and invite you to this conversation as well. Alongside our panelists, Brandi Green, Managing Director of DEI for Work & Co., and Caitlin O'Dowd, DEI Program Manager from Dropbox, to share with you a winning blueprint in the new year. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our co-hosts, Kelsey and Grace. Welcome from Studio Science.
Thank you for the introduction, Chantel. I'm Kelsey. I lead our brand strategy team at Studio Science. And so what that means is I get to work with some amazing strategists and designers to uncover new insights and help our clients come up with innovative solutions. I'm also known at the studio for being outspoken, and I think that's kind of what led us to today's topic, asking those questions and trying to solve problems. I will toss it over to Grace to introduce herself and tell a little bit more about the studio.
Yeah, I think I have a similar reputation at the studio as Kelsey. So I'm really happy to be here today. And like Chantel mentioned, we were both motivated to tap into the DID network to get guidance and knowledge share on all of these topics we're about to dig into. I think some of that motivation came from an acquisition this past year at our agency, and that disrupts and challenges a lot of notions we have about culture and about how we think about DEIB merging different company structures together and prompting organizational change. And so I'm excited to hear from a couple of members of the DID network today. And I lead the brand interaction design team at Studio Science. That's part of my intro. So I think I've covered it all. And I think we can start diving in and get to know our actual panelists today.
Yeah, so we will kick off with Brandi here and getting to know her first. So Brandi, can you share a little bit more about how your company started their DEI journey and specifically how you got into this line of work?
Sure. Hi, I'm Brandi Green. I'm the managing director of DEI at Working Co. And I've been doing DEI for a very long time. I started working in DEI almost was going on probably like 20 years ago at this point. And like many of you, my interest in DER started from a grassroots perspective. And I led an ERG at a very well-known management consulting firm. It was for the racial and ethnic diversity. So it was an umbrella organization that was focused on inclusion and belonging for people who identified as persons of color within the organization. And we were a rather large organization, global, 60 offices. And we launched the ERG and then proceeded to grow it to all 60 to all 60 offices. And that was the beginning of sort of my specific DEI. I was in a talent role before that, but that was the beginning of my DEI role. At Work & Co., I came to Work & Co. About almost 2 years ago now, and their entrance into sort of the DEI space preceded me joining. Similarly, they had some grassroots initiatives with some very passionate colleagues on the floor leading those. And they organized themselves into a group of 4 employee resource groups, which I will be calling ERGs for the remainder of this talk, just so everyone knows what that acronym stands for. And they did a lot of work. And one of the things that they did was really organize and really make a business case for why there needed to be a head of DEI, like an official organized role that was on leadership, and that's how I joined, and that's how sort of my brief history in the beginning stages of formalizing DEI at Working Co. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and could you talk just maybe a little bit more about what your role entails, like what your
Sure.
day-to-day looks like at Working Co. with that job
Sure.
title?
Yes. So I am like similar to you all. I'm a strategist, and I like to say that I'm a designer, and I'm a designer of culture. And it is like to try and use language that helps us all sort of orient what we're like the similarities of what we're trying to do. So what I am ultimately trying to design are cultures where reflexive belonging is centered and where people feel very comfortable being there most authentic, and I like to caveat most authentic professional self, meaning that they can come in and not have to perform um, uh, an inauthentic version of themselves to be accepted. And what that looks like for me is I work very closely with the ERGs. Um, we're in our second year of the strategy. That first year was really taking the temperature of the organization and really understanding sort of from a change initiative perspective where the organization was in its DEI journey and where it felt like it wanted to go. And I think what people should understand about when you're doing that discovery work is that not only are you trying to figure out where the leaders are, right? Like that's a huge part of it because you need to understand what is like what is the comfort level on these topics for your leaders, and sort of where are the boundaries around where you can take this change year over year over year. But then also you need to understand sort of where the organization is in terms of the colleagues. And if you think about it as a bell curve, you're building a strategy for that 80% in the middle, right? Where that's where your organization actually sits. So you'll have some people who on the DEI who are further along on the DEI spectrum, people like you, Kelsey, who are considered outspoken and sort of the champions of DEI. There will also be people that, 10% of people who are behind the curve. But it's really that 80% in the middle that you're really trying to bring along year over year as you're doing this DEI change.
Thank you.
And so in terms of, quickly, and just really quickly in terms of what I do, I work with the ERGs. We do a lot of messaging. We do a lot of being thoughtful about how the business thinks about embedding DEI into their business products and also their overarching business strategy and what that looks like. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and we're excited to hear more from you because, as you mentioned, over 20 years of experience. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of good nuggets that we learn from you today. So tossing it over to Caitlin, kind of the same introduction question for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your company started their DEI journey and specifically how you kind of got into this line of work?
Yep, awesome. Thanks everybody for hosting me. So happy to be here. My name is Caitlin O'Dowd, and I'm on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team at Dropbox. As mentioned, I started my DEI journey actually in academia, and so my educational background is in women and gender studies and critical race theory with a focus on Africana studies. And I actually moved into the nonprofit space. For my first 10 years of my professional career. Actually, it was a little over 10 years before moving into more corporate DEI. So I was actually more focused on international nonprofit engagements, programming, specifically looking at women in the Middle East, barriers to education and health barriers as well, from a community-oriented sense, as well as economical development of poor communities, as well as women within those communities, starting their own business or financial endeavors to support community growth. And I moved into a more corporate DEI setting, first with a small nonprofit that's based out of Austin, Texas called InCast, and then moved over to Dropbox a few years later, where I am currently a diversity business partner. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that includes in a moment, but I've held a variety of different DEI positions at Dropbox over the course of my 7-year tenure, which I know is a long time in the average tenure in tech in the industry. But I've been at Dropbox now for a little over 7 years, and first started with an ERG program management, and then moved over into external partnerships, and then internal programming, mostly focused around our educational pillar. And then more recently have moved into a diversity business partner role, which includes working with some of our most senior leaders to make sure that they feel supported, coached, guided in embedding DEI as a best practice into their business and sub-teams. So that includes a little bit of my day-to-day. I'm either a coach working with employee relations, a coach, a guide working with diversity with other diversity business partners, as well as with HRBPs, our human resources arm, which I'm very close with, and then also working with our talent acquisition folks, our talent management folks, and our learning and development team, as well as our again senior leaders across the company. And in terms of DEI at Dropbox, I'm really happy and proud to say that even still with my long tenure of 7 years, DEI at Dropbox predates myself. In fact, we've, for the longest time that I can remember, have always had a head of DEI, a chief diversity officer, at the very least ERG programming. And ERGs were kind of foundational in terms of the start of our company. Really, it's inherent in our value system, one of which of our values is making work human. So I'm really happy to be at a company where DEI was so much ingrained in just every aspect of the maturity model at Dropbox. And again, I think that goes back to our original founders, CEO, and our values, our core values, which we've always had as well. To my knowledge. Yeah, were there any other aspects of the question that I might have missed as I went on my
No, but I'm excited for the background you're bringing as well today, and hopefully people on the call can benefit from the diverse perspective of, coming from the nonprofit space and now being in the corporate space. I'm sure in the nonprofit space, maybe there wasn't as strong of a culture or systems in place. So excited to learn from your experience and background, not just at Dropbox, but everything else you've done as well. So with that, we will get into the actual panel questions. I'm going to toss it over to Grace to kick us off and lead that conversation.
Yeah, I think you set us up for a really nice segue into our first question, talking about how Dropbox has valued and ingrained into kind of even the very beginning of the business and is modeled by leadership. And I know Brandi touched on a little bit of philosophy with, targeting that 80% of the bell curve, but we were wondering how you think about DEI change happening in an organization. So I think there are a lot of different ways to answer this question. This could be your DEI pillars and the structure at Dropbox. This can be your philosophy on targeting that 80% or top down from leadership, but your perspective on DEI change and how it happens and the strategy behind that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think Dropbox might be a unique case. Of course, everyone that works at their own tech company thinks that they're a unique case, but I go back to feeling a sense of pride in that there were a lot of organizations that only started doing DEI more seriously within the past 3 years. And following the murder of George Floyd and a lot of the attention on the space, not only in corporate but across a variety of different industries, I mean, our team felt very prepared, given that we had had a very robust team dating back even 5 years ago, where we had, comms, DEI comms person, we had ERG program manager, external partnerships, internal partnerships, diversity business partners, and then a chief diversity officer. So we had one of the more bigger teams that I had seen in terms of some of our peer groups of a company Dropbox's size. And so when a lot of attention started to be paid to well, what's really going on in DEI and what does that mean? I think we were very prepared to say, hey, let's roll out the scroll of all the things that we're doing in the way that you can actually partner with us. So it was actually a very exciting moment of engagement for our company to be able to say, hey, we've been looking for this level of attention. We've been looking for you to ask the question of how you can engage. And now we have all these ways that we can tell you about it. So I don't want to say that things have always been easy in terms of DEI shifts and changes that occur externally that then obviously have an effect on a corporate environment. But I think we felt really prepared when a lot of the attention started to be paid to DEI to be able to harness that level of engagement and interest. And we had always taken kind of an innovative approach to education as well. I think when we first started out with rolling out L&OD opportunities, learning and development opportunities, we had been very much okay, here's unconscious bias. And what we found after running that educational series for, I think it was 1.5 years, is that our folks were writing in the surveys saying, hey, we're ready to go to the 201 level. We've got the 101 down, and we want to have more conversations and scenario practice so that we can actually put this into practice instead of just understanding the theoretical. We want to understand how DEI plays out day to day and how to be bias interrupters. And so we went back and said, okay, how do we make this more actionable? How do we think about the daily experiences that people are having within this space? And how do we set them up for success in terms of getting involved in those conversations where they might feel uncomfortable, where they might feel a lack of psychological safety, or where as a manager, they're not creating a team dynamic wherein there's psychological safety. So I think overall, while there's been a lot of shifts and I think the pendulum swings back and forth, just like anything else in this country, where there's excitement and then there's more of a conservative voice that inevitably, there's consequences that we feel, even in our more innovative environment at Dropbox for sure, Supreme Court ruling and everything else. But I think we've been lucky holistically as I look at DEI and the shifts over the 7 years that I've been here. We've been really lucky that we have felt supported by our partners, and we've just continuously had employees banging down the door of what can we actually do? So that's been the biggest challenge for us, is finding ways for people to actually get involved.
I'm curious because Dropbox has a more established program for DEIB and sounds like has for a very long time. What were some of those structures implemented that, maybe you were surprised by coming from nonprofit? Like, oh, there's really established ERGs, or some of those more specific, oh, there's a complete learning and development program for employees just within the DEIB space. So I'm curious some of those like tactical pieces that you've seen make improvements or be beneficial.
Yeah, I was surprised by everything coming from nonprofit into corporate. And it wasn't just DEI. It was like, okay, we have like 100 people that are working in recruiting. Why do we have so many people working in recruiting? And it's like, well, the average tenure is 2 years, and we're constantly, innovating and trying to get new skill sets in the door. And it's just normalized to have a certain level of attrition after a certain time period. So I was like, whoa. I mean, that's just one example where I was like, why do we have all these people that are working in recruiting? We had one recruiter at, some of if that at some of the nonprofits that I worked at. I think one of the other things that comes to mind is just, I don't think it's any secret that we're constantly trying to improve within the tech space as it pertains to representation, both of women and underrepresented minorities. And so I think coming from nonprofit, where women and perhaps underrepresented minorities are the majority, into an environment where that's actually an area of opportunity and a challenge, that was probably the biggest just difference in trying to adjust to that, right? And realizing that there's people who their entire job is to make sure that we're getting diverse representation in the door, especially from an engineering perspective. So I was happy to see that, but I think it was definitely a different environment than what I was used to.
Yeah, I think we could spend the rest of the call talking about the differences between nonprofit to tech, but I think even on this call, we have probably a wide spectrum of kind of fully developed DEIB structures and programs to just beginning in opportunities. Studio Science just became a DID member this past year, and that was really beneficial. It already has been beneficial just to be tapped into this network of like knowledge sharing. So if Brandi feel in a good spot, we've been asking Caitlin a little bit about how she thinks about DEI change within an org, what that's looked like at Dropbox, what that's looked like in nonprofit space. And I know you touched on that strategy of targeting that 80% bell curve, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you think about organizational change happening within, across the spectrum of tech to small agency.
Sure. So I love this question because there are things about DEI change that are developmental or like consistent things in which organizations can sort of see coming. And then there are things that are unique to every organization that are culturally driven by an organization's culture, the leaders, the way in which the organization has set itself up. And so when I'm talking about DEI change, I try to talk about it in 3 different levels. So the first level is the change that individuals have to do. And we call that intrapersonal change, or we can call it individual change to be more casual. Then there is the interpersonal change, which is, so intrapersonal is sort of the cultural ways that we have been conditioned to think about the world around us, right? And so lots of times we've been culturally conditioned before we've ever had an opportunity to opt into how we're being culturally conditioned. You think about your parents, you think about your schools, you think about all the ways of learning that happen before you're ready to opt in, and what you learn about the world based on this cultural conditioning. And that's all the stuff that sits internal to you on an interpersonal level. And lots of times there is some change that we have to do when we get to certain points in our career, certain, when we're moving into full independence, where we have to stop and think about all of the cultural conditioning that we received and whether it's still serving us or whether it is sort of aligned with the person that we want to be now. And so that's all the work that an individual needs to do. And that is both for people who are underrepresented in underrepresented populations and for people who are not in underrepresented populations. Then there is the interpersonal change which is the relational change that happens between two people. So a lot of the ways in which we think about the world and we think about the people that are around us are based on that intrapersonal narrative that we have. So all of that cultural conditioning that we have. And lots of times when we get into community with people who, into communities that are diverse, we start learning and we start seeing and we start understanding that the world might be a little bit different than what we previously understood. And it's those relationships that help ground us in that sort of change that we need to do. How do we do that interpersonal work so that we can relate to people better at the interpersonal level? And then at the institutional level, it is, what is the change that we need to do as an institution? What are the ways that we have previously thought about the world around us? And how has the way that we've thought about people, places, power, how has that informed the policies, the procedures, the programs, sort of all of those things that drive what institutional culture looks like? And so when I'm talking particularly to a new organization about how to think about change, one is sort of helping them understand that we need to be thinking about these three levels, right? And so from a lot of organizations, they'll start an ERG, not really fully understanding what the work that ERG could and should be doing. And a lot of the work that an ERG should and could be doing is on sort of the intrapersonal change that people need to have. What are the beliefs that we have that we bring into our organizations about the way that we are supposed to be or have to be to succeed here? And how does that impact the way that we show up? And is that serving us? Is that serving the organization? Is that serving the future people that could be coming up into the organization as part of that? And I think that change is often missing in the dialogue because that requires leaders to think about how they need to change, but also from an for people who identify as underrepresented, it's really some work that they need to do as well to think about what are some of the assumptions that they're making in the spaces that they're walking through that may not be serving them, that may be holding them back from showing up as their full self or speaking authentically about what they need, what they want, what their experience is like. And when we are holding back, when we're masking that, when we're covering that, we're not giving individuals an opportunity to rise to the occasion to address these inequities. And we are also not participating in our own success in trying to facilitate that change. So I think the biggest thing is like sort of thinking about change more broadly, not just this sweeping thing that happens on one level or this sweeping thing that happens in some amount of time, but something that is developmental, that happens over time, and that you're building sort of new understandings and replacing old understandings and recognizing that we're doing this again at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, at the group level, at the institutional level, and all of those things take time.
Yeah, I love that advice and reminder that, first of all, things take time. That's always hard to remember. And also that every effort has a scope. And so it's important to, no matter where you are.
Exactly.
Spectrum, that you're acknowledging scope. Because I think that's definitely a trap to fall into, to think that you can do it all or change a certain part of the org that's just out of your reach. Yeah.
Or that I think what can happen, and like this gets connected to wellness and burnout and sort of making sure that you're managing realistic expectations. One of the challenges is like when you have an effort and that effort doesn't necessarily, the outcome that you are looking for doesn't land in that first attempt at the effort, just recognizing that this is a change effort and that often that's what happens with change. Like it's sometimes a little unsatisfying, but with every step that you're taking, you're making some opportunity for change. It may not be the full the full order of magnitude of change that you want. But even if you're just planting seeds at this particular stage, just know in 6 months or in 8 months or in a year that those seeds that you settled, once people have started to understand, because again, this is like building a new level of understanding as well, then the environment, the context can change, and then the change will be more readily available at a different time.
I'm curious, and this could be for Brandi or Caitlin, like tying some of these threads together, right? We've talked about the different levels at which change can occur, right? You have the individual, interpersonal, and institutional. And we've talked about, one strategy around DEIB, which is an ERG group. And so as organizations are going into 2024 and trying to set, strategies for the new year, understanding that maybe we don't have an ERG group, or we haven't been thinking about change in those 3 layers. Are there steps that organizations can take to kind of like assess, okay, what is that 80% group willing to engage in? Are we ready for an ERG group? Or like how do you start to like tactically think about change in those 3 buckets for the new year? And that's a pretty big question. So, but Brandi or Caitlin?
Caitlin, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I think before I dig into that a little bit, I want to echo just the 3 focus areas, echo and +1 to the 3 focus areas that Brandi pointed out. I think at Dropbox, in terms of our pillars, our operational pillars, we have the client services aspect, which is the diversity business partner, stakeholder management work. And then there's the programming, which includes external and internal programming initiatives. But above that, we have more strategic focus and direction that come down to 3, what we call 3 diversity commitments. And those include 1, building diverse teams, 2, our commitment to develop and advance equitably, and then 3, this is the one that probably resonates the most with what Brandi said, engaging in personal growth. And we actually talk about certain behaviors based on whether or not you're an individual contributor or a manager, to be able to model those commitments, whether you're CEO or whether you're, just starting at Dropbox in a more junior level. So I just wanted to +1 to those focus areas, because those are also things that we've built into our strategic direction as a team at Dropbox. And then in terms of the question that you asked around what can folks do to assess, I think it's that, assess, right? And there's a couple of different assessments that folks can use. Some are free, some are more costly. Unfortunately, the ones that are the best are probably the more costly. Maybe I can follow up with some examples of those for the group. But to just assess the maturity model of your organization. And that's just really a questionnaire of thinking like, hey, what point are you at in any DEI commitment or journey, or being willing to embrace some of these foundational structures, pillars, strategies at your own organization. And so one assessment in particular, and I'm going to look it up maybe when Brandi's answering, but and post it in the chat. One assessment in particular we've used year over year to kind of assess where we are in our maturity model. And it just helps to step back, because I think as practitioners, DEI practitioners, we're zooming in on like, what's the next phase, right? Rather than like, what phase is my organization ready for, right? And we talked about the swinging pendulum in that there isn't necessarily a linear upward trajectory for where you should be taking your organization. You kind of have to step back a little bit and say, where is my organization at today? And that might be not on the linear path of like DEI maturity. That might look a little bit more like this in terms of how we're thinking about rolling out programming. And so I'm going to find it in a second here before we jump off, because it's been a really good assessment to think about not only DEI, but like, where's your talent acquisition team at in terms of its recruiting practice? Where's your compensation team at? Where's your learning and development team in terms of their development and training offerings? And just thinking holistically across the organization, are we ready for that next step? Are we building? Are we advancing? Are we top tier in terms of what we're offering? Are we innovating? I think it's 4 different categories you can fall into, but I think that's been helpful, the assessment piece and being willing to zoom out a little bit to, in fact, assess.
And I'll jump in. So I love a tool. So one, there's something called the MCOD, the multicultural. Oh, I have to find the exact thing, but it gives like a nice framework in terms of institutional development around equity. And I really like that. Even if it's not something that I share broadly with the organization, it is a useful frame for leaders, often because it can help leaders understand the different options that an organization sort of can take as it tries to become a more diverse and inclusive and equitable organization. And to Caitlin's point, I think like the first thing you need to understand is sort of where you are, and that's really hard to do in the context of just your organization. And I think that is one of like sort of maybe counterintuitive, because I think most organizations want to understand where they are, and it's really hard to understand sort of where your culture is or where you are in your DEI journey without having some sort of benchmarking. And there are lots of organizations that can help you do that benchmarking. There are, lots of, award-winning organizations whose, primary function is to help you assess across organizations so that you can find out, but that's sort of where you sort of want to start. Then I would also suggest that when I'm, again, like more when I'm wearing my consulting hat and I'm thinking about like trying to help an organization figure out where they are and where they want to go. One is, do they actually have the knowledge to actually make that self-assessment, right? So, which is why I think lots of times you want to partner with an organization to help you do that. Do you have enough DEI acumen to understand some of the systematic things that are going on in your organization, or are you still thinking that these things are individual challenges? And sort of when you can sort of figure out where you are in that trajectory, it will start to help you figure out what are some of the interventions that you're ready for at that particular time. And what I would say is, as you're assessing whether or not you are ready for ERGs, and there's actually a good assessment tool there. I'm happy to like email once we get off what those tools look like. But in terms of, are you ready for the ERG? The real question about that is sustainability. Like, do you have enough people? Like, and by enough people, I mean, do you have a handful of people, 2, 3, 6 people who are interested in seeing and having more dialogue around DEI, who are willing to share their experience really transparently? And these, I think, are like two of the biggest things that you need to have in place before you can really start any sort of organized ERG or inclusion council sort of initiative. And part of that is because what you're going to be asking people to do is to figure out how to put narrative behind the experiences that they're having in ways that will help the organization think differently about their experience. That's like the fundamental propeller of change, I would say, at this level before you have any formal organization. And so trying to understand, do you have enough are there enough passionate people around that you can sustain a 1 to 2 year effort at the grassroots level to do a series of talks or do a series of experience shares or organize reverse mentoring or do some cultural awareness events during your awareness month. And if the answer to that is yes, then again, you start really small and you think about, what's one thing I can do? What's one thing that we can do a quarter? And then how do we show the impact of that thing we did? Who did it touch? How did it touch them? How did it change people? And how do we quantify that for both, people who are interested in understanding why this is important, and then for leaders who are making the investment in these groups? Is that helpful?
That is incredibly helpful. I'm also a little bit curious, we've talked a little bit about the grassroots things that individuals who are passionate in organizations can do. We've talked a little bit more about like some assessments that could be maybe more at the institutional level, but I'm curious, like, how do you blend the two? Like, if you have a group of really passionate people and maybe they feel like we're getting stuck, like, how do we get buy-in from our leadership? Do you guys have any best practices for like bringing all of the areas together?
Caitlin, I'll jump and then I'll pass to you and you can. So one of the things that I think is so challenging at this point is, and we talk about the business case in a like as a very abstract thing, and I know a lot of people don't like to orient the work of DEI in a business case. And what I would suggest is that the marrying of the institutional and the interpersonal is around how do you help the organization understand what the business benefit is of thinking strategically about having more of your people included, more of your people involved, more of your people engaged, and why that is of value to the business. And what I would say is early on, as or like organizations who are early in their DEI maturity, I think one of the hardest things is really trying to help them understand why the business case is so important, why you need to tie your efforts into goals that are aligned both with you and the passionate people that are running, the members of the grassroots initiatives that you're trying to build, and then broadly across the organization. And what that might look like is, you know, why is organizing an ERG valuable to the organization, and how do you put something together that demonstrates it? So as an example, when I worked at a different firm, the queer group came to us and they said, we recognize that some of the experiences that our queer colleagues are having are really relevant in terms of our clients as well. And we think there's a big missed opportunity because you don't understand how the inclusion of your LGBTQ plus colleagues translates into also stronger relationships that you have with your clients. And so helping them understand the context, for example, why using the proper pronouns with your colleagues is equally as important, if not more important, with your clients. Having you understand why this is such a value to you outside of the like for your employees, but also how do we sort of broaden the eye as to how all of these things are connected in different spaces. You being able to be a more inclusive leader within your organizations makes you a more inclusive business partner with your clients, makes you more attractive to the different brands that you want to be in collaboration with. And it's really just helping people at the grassroots level understand how to make those connections and how to really think, instead of thinking so granularly about like these instances that are happening on the ground, what is the bigger picture for why these instances, like why we need to address these instances that are happening, and what is the broader business impact? And then how do I help the organization articulate that? And then how do I show the value of that change? How do I quantify that value of change? This translated into us being able to keep more people within the organization. That translated into that greater retention, translated into higher engagement. That higher engagement translated into better products. Whatever the connections are, how do we put our strategy hat on, even at the grassroots level, and think about connecting the dots for those leaders? And Caitlin, I'm sure you have some tidbits to also share.
I was going to ask really quickly if someone could repeat the question because it cut out for me. And I was just listening to Brandi go on without context, which I mean, still all relevant, but I was like, wait, I didn't hear, the sound cut out.
Yeah, I can repeat the question. It was about, if there's individuals in an organization who feel super passionate, and maybe it's more like grassroots led initiatives, and they feel like they're getting kind of like stuck, and they're looking for ways to get leadership to buy in or support the things they're passionate about. If you have any sort of like best practices or ways to go about kind of amplifying, right? Like you have those 3 swim lanes we talked about, but how do you get them all aligned and working together and bought into the same vision and goals?
Yeah, I think this is the example that comes to mind, or just the situation where this question resonates most is just for our ERG co-leads. So we have 7 ERGs at Dropbox that are all pretty tenured. I guess our newest one is Enable. But these are not people's core scope of role, right? And they might have some smaller financial reward or any other type of spotlight bonus tied to being an ERG co-lead. But it's an additional series of work, right? And in a certain way, it's volunteerism, right? And so we've got folks who are taking additional time out of their day, and oftentimes working after hours to lead these community groups, to provide leadership, to provide resources, ensure they get some level of visibility, especially with our sponsors. They're presenting on behalf of their community group at any given time. They're the main resource for that community, as a mentor, as a sponsor, as a lead. And so there's a lot of visibility that comes with that, but it's added frustration when this is an additional workload, and sometimes you don't get the amount of engagement either from senior leadership, your sponsor, or even your own community membership, to either for a Heritage Month or for a conference to show up to participate. And so that's where I see some of that frustration come through, is like doing extra work in addition to my core workload, and I'm not getting the level of traction, or I'm not getting the amount of support. And I don't really hear that as often, but I think it really comes from the idea that this is an added workload, right? And so I think what's been helpful for us is to have very clear charter and mission statements for our ERGs, so that our sponsors know how they are expected to engage with co-leads, right? That they're supposed to be meeting with them monthly, that they're supposed to come to the community meetings, that they're supposed to host some sort of virtual event once a quarter, that they're supposed to send out emails when things that are impacting the community happen, either internally or externally, that they're supposed to be engaging in a certain way, that they're not just holding a sponsorship position as a leader and that's just what they're doing, that they're engaging in a way that's actually meaningful and impactful. And so that's where I think DEI comes in to reinforce those expectations, to help to build those expectations. And then one of the things that we do, especially for Heritage Month, is that we have our all company all hands, which is, for company wide and is very well attended, from folks who are in different locations, globally and nationally. And for every Heritage Month that we have our co-leads actually come out and present to the entire organization, either at the beginning of the month to kick off, to remind people of different activities that are taking place, or at the end, to do a recap. And I know that feels really maybe small and insignificant to some people, but it's huge. It's actually huge, because that is a select moment in time. And it's not just like, here's DEI having a town hall over here, and that's where we talk about Heritage Month. It's like, no, we talk about Heritage Month in front of the entire company, because that's how important it is to the business. And the CEO will be introducing this individual to make sure that they're kicking off the month, and that we're all reminded of ways that we can engage. So I think it's things like that DEI should be driving, especially for individuals who are taking on these volunteer positions, either as champions or as co-leads, to make sure that they feel supported and that they're getting the level of visibility that make those positions worthwhile.
And just, if I could just jump in real quick, because
Yeah.
I love the framing of that. And what I would really, one of the things I think is really helpful is to think about the work that you want to do in the same sort of strategic way that you think about the rest of your work. So really thinking in terms of high impact and low, especially because you're doing this off the side of your desk, but like really thinking about like, what is it that we can accomplish? Really managing expectations of both the people who are leading these and members. When I first came to Working Co, the loftiness of what people wanted to do very early on in an ERG, and like really just sitting down and having conversations and saying, like, from a people resourcing standpoint, who do you have to run the 15 initiatives that you want to do this year? And is this actually viable? Right? Like just orienting us in sort of the reality of our own situation, and then coming to terms with the fact that like we don't have an enormous amount of people resources, and we don't have an enormous amount of financial resources. So let's rethink like what is actually plausible. Now that we understand like what we're working with, what are the most high impact things that we can do given the actual reality of the resources that we can have, right? So that might mean for some organization that's starting off in early on, you might want to do something that's once a month. But really, what might actually be the most valuable to your organization and to your members is something that is once a quarter, or something that is like something that starts out. And I mean this, because everyone is coming to this work with the best of intentions, but we do have to manage the expectation that the people who are working on grassroots, what your role in this entire DEI change pie is to surface what needs to be changed. It's to surface it, it's to share your experience and to partner with people who are responsible for leading that change. And I think that is a very difficult, like, part of the coaching that I do with leads is to really help them understand that like you're not failing, right? Like this is someone's whole job. This is someone who has like a whole bonus structure and a whole there are people who are really responsible, and that is not you at this particular point. What your role is to partner with the people who are responsible for this and say like, what should this look like? Or here are some of the pain points that we're having, and what does the next iteration of change look like? And I think particularly because I think many of you are early in this, I think that is hard to hear, but so valuable to accept early on, because it will stop you from wasting resources. It will stop you from burnout. And then when you start to think more strategically about like what you can do, what are the organizations like DEIB that you can partner with, that you can get leverage from? Where are the other ERGs? Who can mentor you? Who can help? Who can you bring in to partner with your resources to do something that's slightly bigger scale? But how do we stay realistic about where we are in our journey, what resources we have, and what we can do with those resources? And then from a metric standpoint, how do we show the impact? Because I think that's like the big thing. How do you demonstrate the impact? Even if you've just done 3 events, how do you demonstrate with the numbers like how well this was attended? Are you doing post event surveys that are saying, please, I want some more? Like, how can you demonstrate that these things are valuable to your constituents, to your members? And how do you make that as transparent as possible to the leaders who are ultimately you're ultimately going to have to report to?
That was amazing. And I hate to cut the conversation, but Brandi, everything you just said, I'm like, oh, that's what we do at DID. Like you even spoke to my soul. I'm like, yep, that's how we think about capacity, impact with a team of 5. Like, how can we have the biggest impact? And to your point, we hope to continue and scaling that impact by having these discussions, partnering with organizations so we can help, because we do understand that it is someone's whole job. Like my whole job is DID, right? Like, and so I don't expect Kelsey or Grace to figure out all the things, but I am here to support that effort and manage conversations like this to then be an aid to the work that they do, and support the capacity that they have. So that was beautiful. So thank you so much. I know we only have 5 minutes, but I do want to open it up for Q&A very briefly, even if it's just 1 or 2 questions. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and feel free to put it in the chat. And as we wait for those to come in, feel free to unmute, share any comments, and or if Caitlin, Grace, Kelsey, any final tidbits, I welcome those as well as we wait for some questions in the chat.
I just want to add to what Brandi said, or maybe build on it, and talking about and thinking about capacity, bandwidth, and working in this space. As many of us in this room are working in this space during a time of a lot of external challenge, right, and pushback. Sometimes you just got to protect your peace, right, so that you can continue to work in a challenging space. And that means, self-care and leaning out when you need to lean out. Because I know as a woman of color that a lot of these things that I'm working on are very personal to me. And that's okay. That doesn't make me any worse at the job. In fact, sometimes that makes me better at the job, but that also means that I need to be able to balance and protect my peace of mind so that I'm giving this work the best that I can, right?
Perfect. Thanks, Caitlin. Brandi, I'll let you answer the question in the chat.
Sure. I don't know if it's Elisa or Alyssa. Forgive me. The question is, how do you find people to give talks to the ERG? Now, this is going to be a little bit controversial because very early on when in DEI initiatives, what I find is that people at the grassroots and even some early DEI leaders tend to want to seek external expertise, which can be good. What I want to encourage people to think a little bit differently on is the balance of who you're hearing from. So, bringing someone into an organization a couple of times a year to give you a fresh take, to explain a complex a topic area, to inspire your people to continue on through burnout. These are all, I think, really good uses of your budget and good uses of resources. However, you have a lot of talent in your organization. You have a lot of talent. You have a lot of people that can speak to their own lived experience, their own work experience. And what I want to caution and why I want to caution, and is this. Have you ever, imagine being in an organization as someone who is underrepresented and you've tried to raise challenges or issues or experiences and you have not gotten a lot of traction. And then 8 months after you have tried to raise these things, your organization brings in someone who has, for some reason, been granted some on high title that makes what they have to say more valuable than what you told your organization 8 months ago. And so I just want to caution, because what can happen is that a person sitting in that space can really experience some resentment, because what it feels like is that I have to have a PhD at the end of my name, or I have to have written a book, or I have had to do what X number of jumping through some sort of expertise hoop for you to take me and my experience seriously. And I think just recognize the flip side of that. It's not to say that you should never bring expert people in. You should absolutely bring expert people in. But you should, again, I'm always going to go back to strategy. Really think strategically about what you're bringing in. Are there ways to bring people in and partner them with other people in your organization? And so that's my main thing. And then in terms of how to find people, you'll be surprised. LinkedIn is a good, I'm sure the DID network has loads of leads for you. And then again, in terms of how you partner with other organizations, I know this may sound strange, but I've often brought in other ERGs into the organization to help talk to my ERG leads, to help to run brainstorming sessions, to talk about things that have worked in the past, that have or things that haven't worked in the past. And so really thinking outside the box, not just wanting to get, the person that you saw on Good Morning America, but also some people who are on the ground doing the work.
I know we're at time, but I'm going to lean on Halima, who raised her hand. And thank you guys for hanging in there with us. Go ahead, Halima.
No, well, thank you for that. And Brandi, you didn't say anything controversial. You said something very true in that a lot of organizations, I've worked, in a variety of different ones, but many times ERGs or the organizations get caught up with the bells and whistles of someone's, alphabet soup behind their name, or as a friend of mine would always say, the only difference with what you told them versus what I told them is I came in on a plane. So there's, a belief that sometimes this information that they're hearing from this person is, to be esteemed at a higher level. And it could be valuable and have some good nuggets, but you've likely told them the same thing. Conversely, there are, of course, times and places where you do need to bring that expert in, one, to give yourself a break, because you don't want to be the person always speaking and always having the mic, and allowing them to hear from others. So I think there's a right balance to ensure that you're not fully carrying the load and that you share it with other people. And it's also important for executive buy-in and support sometimes to get those, other DEI practitioners on board and involved. So great conversation, and good to see everybody.
Likewise, thank you. So thank you guys so much. Thank you, Kelsey, Grace, Studio Science, Caitlin, Brandi. I cannot thank you guys enough. We hope this conversation left you all inspired, thinking about how do you want to walk into the new year. And just make sure that you remember that it takes time to create change. Also, please plant the seeds in 2024, start planting those seeds, and just also remember that every scope has a timeline.